we're fortunate enough to have Tom Coulter presenting. We'll turn the time over to him here in just a moment. I want to go through our standard updates on NSF's program and our transition plan. So the agenda for today is the transition plan benchmarks. Tom's going to talk to us about acceptance authority media, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. As Katie mentioned, we need to make sure we're using that chat function if you have any questions that come up along the way, and we'll be sure to address those questions. Chances are we're going to wait until the very end of the session and address all the questions at once, unless we see something come up that needs to be clarified right away. So with that said, I'll jump into the plan benchmarks. And as we know, we've completed all of our 2016 benchmarks. 2017 benchmarks are nearing completion as well. We have a couple key deadlines for the NSF office, and those are essentially risk mitigation plans for anybody that's not transitioned. And this is to ensure that we've allocated enough resources and we've got our risks identified. There is a deliverable associated with one of those, and that's the December deadline that we have to pass off. But we're going to be monitoring this on an ongoing basis just to make sure that we're not introducing a whole lot of risk into our accreditations and to your certificates. The key deadline for everybody to remember, though, is 9/15 of 18, and that's the date that the old standards are canceled. The 9001, 2008 base standards are canceled, and everything beyond that has to be to the new standard. As we've talked before, we're trying to get all of the certificates transitioned by about June of 2018, meaning that your audits are scheduled and conducted by the end of June of 2018. That way we can ensure that you have the needed time to go through corrective actions and get those closed out prior to that to the September 15th deadline. Unfortunately, if your certificate isn't upgraded, meaning audit completed and corrective actions closed prior to that deadline, then the old certificate rides off into the sunset and we get the opportunity to start over with a stage 1 and stage 2. Nobody wants that. I'm sure everybody would like to keep their existing certificate and just go the easier path, so that's the way we're going to proceed. We want to make sure that everybody has that deadline in mind. So with that said, we're going to get into Tom's portion of the course. Tom is going to talk to us about acceptance authority media. Katie gave his bio a little bit, and for clarification, this is something that Tom presented at the RMC Auditor Workshop. So all North, Central, and South American aerospace auditors had the opportunity to hear this session from Tom, and I was pretty impressed by what he did with the presentation. So I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to share this information with all of our clients, and Tom was gracious enough to provide us with that opportunity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Katie's already read through his bio here, so we'll just let him jump right into the presentation.
Thanks, Don. So, hi everyone. Like Don said and the agenda says, I just want to share with everyone some information on acceptance authority media, share you some background information, what it is, and talk about how we're implementing it in the industry. Just a little bit of background reason for this and emphasis on this is a couple of years ago, I guess, I was in a workshop for auditors and we're talking nonconformances, and the presenter had stated something to the effect that a finding or a nonconformance is like a gift. It's an unopened present. And that's something where it's an opportunity for improvement within the QMS that we never know existed. So this is consider this to be a gift to everybody that's being shared with you, and we're opening up the present. This was a gift that's actually been received from regulatory agencies on the subject of acceptance authority media. So a little bit of background, like I was talking about, is there's some increased oversight on the proper use of AAM by member companies. Regulatory agencies, i.e. FAA, DCMA, have some increased attention to this, as well as personal warranty, which is pretty much what acceptance authority media represents. There's also some activities going on with the Supply Chain Management Handbook, which I understand that they are working on to update to provide some further development and materials on what acceptance authority media is. And then obviously we have the 9100 standard that discusses personal warranty and compliance. So we'll kind of share some of that information with you. So when we think of AAM, if you say that to somebody or an individual, you may get that deer in the headlights kind of look in terms of, well, what is that? And basically we're talking about stamps. And then of course it goes, oh yeah, I got a stamp. I know what that means. But there's a lot of other facets and everything to AAM. Obviously with technology and everything, maybe we don't have as much reliance on stamps anymore as we may with password control, badge swipers, fingerprint control, whatever, PIN numbers that are put in. So anything that's used to denote or acceptance of a document or something passed through through the production process. There's some other background in terms of violations or what it means to the regulatory agency is that it is an enforceable requirement that's flowed down by the FAA, and we'll share some information with you on that too. So talking about some terms and definitions, this is basically acceptance authority media is defined by the organization. So they define what it is, and that's how do you determine what the status of their outputs are with respect to conformity, configuration, measurements, and everything that's going on within their system. The other one is the stamp. Basically, it's typically a identifying mark or characteristic, some kind of device, impression that you make on paperwork or documentation. Usually, it says, "Yep, this has been good. We're good to go. Move on to the next step. This part conforms." And then more prevalent, we probably see is or increasing is electronic signatures. Which could be anywhere from, like I was talking about, swiping your badge, logging into a work order sequence operation under your ID that you may be approved to, as well as passwords, which could be the same thing with automated work orders. So coming back to kind of the baseline on the origin of this requirement, or why does it exist and how it relates to regulatory requirements, is that this is an excerpt from the FAA regulations, Title 14, Part 21. And if you just take a read it, I'll give you about 30 seconds or something, but if you take a look at some of the words there, there's some pretty strong wording in there. They talk about falsification. You use the word, you see fraudulent in there. So some pretty strong wording. And when you think about it, nobody does that purposefully, right? Or very few people do. A lot of the times when we're talking to AAM, people may not understand the requirement as opposed to actually knowing what the requirement is but just stamping it off anyway or accepting it. But this is the perspective of the regulations, and this is the perspective of what we're working to, within industry and buying things off, especially if it's under an FAA program. So sharing some of the AES 9100 references in terms of where that comes to play. If we take a look at Section 852, which is identification traceability, this is where it talks about acceptance authority media. And this is the only section in 9100 that says the words acceptance authority media. And like we said before, it's really up to the organization to define what that is and what that process is. Some other references in 9100 include Section 8.6, where it talks about the organization shall retain documented information for the release of products and services. So obviously before something can go to the next step, before they can release it, wherever it is in the value stream, from receiving inspection to the stockroom, from the stockroom to production, from the supplier to delivery or something like that, there's some method of release. And all of that is denoted by some form of acceptance authority media. Stamp, certificate of conformance has a signature on it. A work order has a work order operation bought off on it in terms of final operation. An NCR tag or rejection that may be associated with a work order has a final disposition on it. So those are all examples of what we're talking about in terms of the release of the product and where it is in the system. And obviously each one of those signatures is traceable to an individual. Okay. So another section of 9100 talks about configuration management in Section 8.1.2, and that's basically ensuring the documented information is consistent with the actual attributes of the products. So this is kind of one of the things where we come to in terms of the configuration management and the information that's there. What does the certificate of conformance say? What does the work order say? What does the inspection checklist say? The person who's stamping it off, obviously they're warranting that, they're stamping it off saying it is, but it's really key and important to understand, do they understand what that means? What is it that it means when you're applying your acceptance of that, and how are you aware of it? If you don't know what it means, where do you go to get that information? So in terms of the violation of the requirements, basically, and how this came about is that the FAA took some surveys, did some auditing of various IAQG member companies, and they came up with a series of findings regarding the subject of AAM. And obviously, that's the gift that I'm sharing with you in terms of that gift has been opened and industry has been working on it. There's the misconception a lot of times when we say AAM that it's often referred to as stamping. But again, like I was talking about earlier, it comes in different forms. Signatures on certificates of conformance, swiping your badge, or using a unique ID to log into an automated work order system. Those are all examples of it. Okay. So some of the violations that were noted or improper use was basically errors where, I mean, this is probably typically more so in a paperwork kind of system to where I have a hard copy of a work order that's sent out, or an ATP maybe, or possibly a receiving inspection checklist, and it has 2 or 3 pages and 5 or 10 or 20 sequences on it. Sequences 1 through 3 are stamped, sequence 4 is missing a stamp, and sequence 9, 10, 11 are okay. And then, of course, we get into the auditing world or in the experience, we come back and says, well, we don't stamp that operation. We sign it off. Or actually, that one's not supposed to be stamped. So not only is it, if you're missing a stamp, is it understood why it's missing or why there's no signature required or whatever, which can be perfectly acceptable. But it's critical for the organization to define when is it and when is it not required, so that it's very clear so people can go back and understand that, rather than being faced with it at the time of an audit or something we want to avoid. Another example of violations is untimely use. When the operation is complete, it should be stamped then. Obviously, if the operation is not complete, most definitely it should not be completed. And obviously, if it's stamped after the fact, in terms of days or weeks or something, then it becomes questionable. And also, misrepresentation is the person who is accepting that operation or accepting that activity authorized, qualified to do that work. In electronic worlds, it's probably more control on it because you can probably link the systems with training records and certain activities that they're able to do. In a paperwork world, it may be less so. So things to be aware of, things to consider. And obviously, the last one is training deficiencies, like I was talking about earlier. Do people understand what it is that they're stamping off? Do they understand when to do it, when not to do it? And do they understand where to go in terms of if they have questions? Another basic question or concept to think of is like, what if you want to withdraw your stamp or cancel it? How do you void it out? Do you take white out and cover it up? And hopefully the answer to that is no. Or do you cross it out and say void? Any various examples of that. So taking a look at the QMS system as a whole from an organization, obviously there's different aspects or facets of it that may apply. But obviously we're all doing audit oversight, and that's how this comes about and how we were presented this item in the first place from the regulatory agencies. But if you take a look at the QMS, things to consider would be the documented information. What policies, procedures, training is policies and procedures is existence within the organization to make a clear definition of what that is, how to use it. Okay. The other process is controlling that access, be it password control or issuance of stamps. And obviously, when that access is granted, whatever mean it is, when the person signs that document, are they taking that personal warranty and understanding what they're doing? Do they understand that when they apply something, they know what it means? And if they don't know what it means, then are they not signing that form until they get that clarification? And obviously the leadership within the organization through management review processes, through regular meetings or status reports, that's what we're looking for, oversight. How is the organization performing in general? One of the things that we're always challenged with is training records. Are people up to date on their training? If it's periodic training, have they completed that training or not? Obviously, you don't want to find out people are completing operations where it is periodic training is required. So, auditing activity in terms of looking at the process in its entirety, yeah, they've accepted the work order and great, they've had that approval for 10 years, but they lapsed 3 months ago in a training because they were sick or they were on holiday. So again, you want to keep up to date on all that, and that's where we trust the QMS system will keep track of that. So talking about consequences and non-compliance. Obviously, anytime a question comes into play or we have improper acceptance, then we have increased cost and loss of production, which leads to quality escapes. We find out later, oh, wait a minute, that shouldn't have been done. We have to recall the product. Liability issues, reputation, civil fines and penalties, all these kind of examples are the consequences of nonconformance. And up to the point where it comes to the regulatory requirements, again, remember the words in terms of fraudulent or deceiving, there could be civil penalties, which is not good, but also individuals can be held accountable and have jail time. And obviously the worst thing we want to have is any kind of incident that may happen out there with whatever product is in service and causing injury, which we want to avoid. So from the audit perspective and just talking about expectations, when they're doing the auditing, talk to the individuals applying the stamps or whatever practice or whatever activity they're doing for releasing product, and just understand, do they show the competence and awareness of what it is that they're accepting? Do they have available to them whatever the design data is to support what they're inspecting? Do they know how to cancel their approval if they find out afterwards that it's not correct? Taking a look at completed work orders and just sampling them to see if there's any errors, omissions, typos, legibility, missed operations. Taking a look at in-process work orders and documents associated with it. So a lot of times we think of it as a work order or a shop travel or something that builds this part, but there's other ancillary documents that support that process, right? As an example, you may have 20 sequences on there, and sequence 15 has a nonconformance because the machine went down or there was considered they had to do further rework. So there would be an NCR associated with that. So when do you know that you can stamp off that operation after the NCR has been issued or closed? Does the operator who's accepting that operation know what the process is? Likewise, you may have pickup sheets or squawk sheets. It's not necessarily nonconformance. It's something that can be reworked. Hey, we just need to get some other information or clarification or touch-up here. Are all of those supporting pickups or squawk sheets bought off before that operation goes on, or is there something that consumes that within the work order so they know, yep, we're all done? The training course and the materials, obviously a key element. Do people understand what the requirements are, how to use it? Okay. So just a summary, in terms of the acceptance authority media, obviously documentation needs to be retained, personal warranty information, release of who is it within the organization that has these authorities, what is the requirements for them to be trained to, and are they qualified and competent to perform those? And preferably, is there some kind of objective evidence that shows this is the kind of training qualification they went to? Typically, it's not going to be a root cause for stamping it off. It is more of a direct cause. And what I say by that is that the person is stamping it off, so that's what caused the problem. But the real root cause is they weren't adequately trained, or they didn't have access to the data needed to make the informed decision, is it okay to release this or not? So from the easiest standpoint, in terms of at its most simplest convention, if it had not been documented complete, or had been in the case of missing AM, there would not have been a QMS escapement. So really, it's really key to the QMS to be adequate enough to define the process of what that is. And it's important, but it's critical. If we don't know when or not to use it, we need to make sure we are aware of that. If the manufacturing plan calls out operations that are no longer performed or no longer required, don't stamp it off, but get back to the manufacturing engineering or whoever owns the work orders to say, this isn't going to work. This operation needs to change, or it needs to be deleted, or it needs to be moved here, or something like that. So again, making sure that people are empowered and understand that if they're forced to stamp something off, that they need to be able to say, this is how my process works to update the work order or change the manufacturing plan. And that's all I had to share with everybody. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Don or Katie, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Very good. I want to thank Tom for his participation and for his for sharing that insight with us. We'll open it up to some questions and answers, and if you have questions, again, use that feedback section in the lower corner of your screen or in your screen there, and we'll be sure to address those. First one here is, do you have a question? Okay. Give it just a minute and see if anybody else has any questions. We'll let those come in, and while we're waiting on that, I'm going to go through the last portion of our slide deck. As always, I like to talk about some of the resources that exist from both the IAQG and from NSF. The first one here is from the IAQG website, and this is sae.org/IAQG. And you'll notice over here on the left-hand side we have the Supply Chain Management Handbook. An excellent resource if you're interested in acceptance authority media, FOD, counterfeit, anything and everything that you are curious about in regard to how to implement an aerospace quality management system, or frankly even how to improve your system. There's a lot of great information that's available here, so go check it out. The other section I want to point you to is the IAQG standard questions, and this is available from this link. If you're looking for 9100 specific stuff, this will take you to the same location. And because they like to have it very accessible, it's also available here under deployment support materials. But any one of those will take you to a page that's associated with the different standards of the aerospace quality management systems, and it will give you a ton of resources for like the FAQs, the clarifications document. There's one that's an auditor guidance material document. Really, really cool thing. Goes clause by clause and talks about what, as an auditor for a third party or even for an internal auditor, what should we be looking at to show conformity to the different clauses of the standard. So excellent resources. Go check those out. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us, and we'll point you to them. For the NSF website resources, we have from our nsf.org/info/ISO-updates. There's the AS9100 2016 tab. And this is where you can find all of the webinar series, including this one in a couple days. Katie will have it posted up there. And then all of the previous webinars are available from there as well. You can go download those at your leisure and listen to them to make sure that you're understanding the different change topics of the standard. And if you have any suggestions on what to talk about for future webinars, feel free to email us. Some other resources that are available from that NSF website, we have a transition guide document. It's going to talk through our process for transitioning. We have a gap assessment tool that's similar to the one that's available on the IAQG website. A couple extra columns have been added just to make it a little more user-friendly. Another cool feature of this is it tells you, comparing the old standards to the new standard, it will tell you what has changed, or if there was a change to the different sections, and where I could find that in the old standard. So if you're wondering the differences between the old and the new, this is a great resource for you to go look at. We also have an internal audit tool, which is a OER-like device, an OER-type tool that allows you to go conduct an internal audit against all the requirements, and every shall statement's broken down into a different box. So you can certainly grab that, use it as an internal audit resource to help supplement your program and ensure that you're doing a full and complete internal audit. Again, these are optional. As it says down here, these are definitely optional resources. They're not required, but if you want to use them, feel free to use them. They're there for the taking. The last slide I want to put up here while we're answering any questions that come up is the contact information for both Mike and me. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email. We're happy to address anything that comes up. And if it's directed at Tom, we'll be sure to get in contact with him and make sure that he knows. At this point, I've got two questions that have come up. One from Dennis. It says, coming from the FAA world, do you need to use blue or black ink when making changes? And Tom can probably speak to that better than I at this point. Tom, what's your take on that?
So Tom went to Google and he typed in FAA black or blue ink. And I came up with about 6 or 7 hits on here in terms of talking about an FAA Form 8060. You can be dark blue, or black ink. Another one talks about signing your logbook with pen or pencil. Another one talks about blue ink in your logbook. I'm not aware of any FAA orders or advisory circulars or any FARs that cite the color of the ink. Not to say that there is any. Again, I'm not going to proclaim to be an expert. My only recommendation is that the organization in their procedure someplace would define the process of what is acceptable or what isn't. If they want to use orange or red, more power to them. But typically, I think in industry we see black or blue, and I think if you're going to use that, you should be safe. Sometimes I've heard the words that, well, on the originals you always have to do blue, and on copies it can be black because copy machines copy black. But today with color copiers and all that kind of stuff, it kind of moots out the point. So I would really, I would encourage the organization to define it in their procedures and or in their training material in terms of what's acceptable. And if they're not sure, then just ask the regulatory agencies or their customers.
And I'll add on to that it's not just the regulatory agencies that we have to be concerned about. This is a great point to. This is a great time for us to say that your customer contract may dictate the color of ink that's required. A lot of those contracts have some legacy information in there that still references must be done in blue for an original because that was the expectation historically. And if it's a customer requirement, we're still required to follow that unless we take contractual exception to it. So the FAA may not directly say thou shalt, but if the customer contract says thou shalt, then you have to. Very good
point, Don. And again, it's the more detail you get in, obviously, the more opportunity for audit challenges there are.
Absolutely. Okay, next question here comes from Stephanie. Stephanie says, when stamps are assigned, we have stamp control form in which the impression of the stamp is put on form with the individual's name and department number, which is signed by the individuals. We have the manager validate the forms twice a year. Does that sound okay? Now, from the auditor's perspective, I think that sounds perfectly fine as long as that's your process and you're executing to that process. You're demonstrating control. You have some traceability associated with who's assigned that stamp. You're verifying that the stamp is correct, and you have the ability to compare the signature and the name of the employee associated with that stamp as well. So you're really creating a linkage to all of those, and you're double-checking them. I mean, there's some other facets to acceptance authority media, like ensuring that if it's lost, there's some resolution that's done, or if somebody isn't competent to maintain that stamp, that's taken away. But from the cursory review, I think that's a perfectly fine approach. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the only thing I would add to that is the precursor to signing the form. When they got to the point of signing the form, what training and or orientation had they gone to in terms of this is how to use that stamp, this is where to go to information, this is how you resolve issues. So obviously there should be a level set understanding between the manager and the employee in terms of how they got there to that point where they're getting the stamp and signing the form.
Excellent point. I think that's all the questions we have. I'll give Mike a quick opportunity to interject any opinions that he might have here, and then I think we can end real quickly. So Mike, if you want to say a few words.
For once in my life, I have very little to say. It was well done. I don't have anything to add. I enjoyed the presentation again.
So I guess on behalf of NSF, I want to say thank you to Tom for gracing us with your presence today and imparting this wonderful wisdom on our clients and our auditors. Again, it's much appreciated, and I think we've all benefited from that. And for the numerous clients that have attended and will listen to the recording later on, thank you for joining us. Obviously, it takes a little bit of effort to put these sessions together, and we want to make sure that they're value add to you, and I think this topic definitely helps us all to understand the needs and expectations of the industry, the regulatory authorities, and really to build a more robust process for ourselves and for our customers and our end users. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.